Welcome to part 3 of period 3. This is going to cover the American Revolution from 1775 to 1783. To be honest, the most important things to get out of this is common sense, the Declaration of Independence, why the French helped us, and ultimately the impacts of this war on the colonial and now American society. So, following Lexington and Concord, we get the Second Continental Congress, the second time the colonies get together, just like they had originally planned in May of 1775. At this point, though, at least now shots have actually been fired, so it really does change things for many colonists. At the same time, no one's truly completely ready to declare independence. Nonetheless, they recognize that the shots fired in Lexington and Concord are not just warning shots any longer. The Boston Massacre was a warning shot. The response with all of the acts were warning shots. These shots fired in Lexington and Concord are now officially the British starting to send in troops. So they decide to organize the Continental Army with George Washington as the commander-in-chief of that army. The first major battle for this Continental Army is at Bunker Hill. The colonists lose. A quick hint to you, the colonists lose most of the battles for the first few years of this war. And American history is really based on a lot of, we almost did it. Look at how good we feel at the end of this. And that's where a lot of our battles come from. And that's why we don't talk about a ton of them, is because they weren't all that great. As I said to a few of you before, the best thing about George Washington as the commander-in-chief of the military is he knew when to either, put up the white flag and claim defeat and get the heck out of there, or just retreat. In the case of Bunker Hill, the British ultimately win, and they do take the hill. But the colonists really do hold their own in this first big battle, and it helps to build quite a bit of confidence and actually helps to increase the signing up for the Minutemen. At the same time the colonists are doing this, as I said before, they weren't 100% sure they wanted to declare independence yet. So they actually send one final petition to King George III called the Olive Branch Petition, seeking peace. Please, 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 King George III, can we not head into war? The king ultimately dismisses the Olive Branch Petition and declares the colonies are in full-out rebellion. Again, I cannot stress this enough. In 1775, there is still not a clear consensus in the colonies that they really want independence. So how do you convince a bunch of people who are scared to go to war against one of the biggest militaries in the world in this moment for their freedom? Well, you dig deep into the Enlightenment ideas of John Locke and Rousseau. John Locke and Rousseau are ultimately going to be two of the main Enlightenment thinkers who ultimately help the founders write the Declaration of Independence and establish the Constitution we have. John Locke, in particular, is a name that is always going to come up on the AP exam or any U.S. history test you take in terms of his influence on both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, because his philosophies were really focused on this idea that everybody was born with natural rights and that the power of the government is ultimately derived from popular consent. It's not to say that John Locke was a perfect man by any means. I don't know if you remember an earlier story this year, John Locke was mentioned as writing that horrific story about his journey to Africa. But ultimately, when it came to philosophies regarding the general structures of governments, it was something that the colonists really hung to. Now, while this is great for those in the colonies who are rather literate and really pay attention to, it didn't necessarily hit home for everyone. And that's why Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, is so important. Common Sense is a 24-page pamphlet that was written by a man by the name of Thomas Paine, who was actually from England. When he got to the colonies, he recognized what they were fighting for, and he printed this pamphlet in January of 1776, and he had some very radical ideas for his time. He believed that the colonies should establish a new type of government, and it wasn't actually new, it was actually very ancient. He believed the colonies should establish a republic, a representative government run by the people, based on the concept that everybody has natural rights. And when I say everybody, part of what made Thomas Paine so radical is he truly meant everybody. He was very influenced by the Enlightenment, but he wrote Common Sense and he titled it Common Sense on purpose because he used very, very familiar religious allegories that everybody understood because of how important religion was to them. So ultimately, he was speaking their language. While not everybody could read Common Sense themselves, Common Sense became the most printed document in all of the colonies during the first few months it had even come into existence. And people would stand outside and listen to others read Common Sense aloud in town squares, in bars, in churches, as a way to try and inspire more colonists to join up. One of the big messages he had in there was the point that the colonies existed in a continent that was so much bigger than England ever was physically, that it was mind-boggling to assume that a tiny island could control a massive continent. And the simple language and the simple arguments he made ultimately helped to really push a lot of colonists towards the side of independence. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, as well as the other Enlightenment thinkers, ultimately helped to inspire the founders come up with the ideas for the Declaration of Independence. The final document was drafted by Thomas Jefferson, who took everybody's ideas and tried to create a singular document. The goals of the Declaration of Independence were to justify the independence by listing all of the grievances against King George III, while also stating what they were fighting for. Consider the Declaration of Independence the most famous breakup letter of all time. One thing that got taken out of the Declaration of Independence was the part where the founders had contemplated writing about how they were against slavery. They took that out for obvious reasons. Their economies, once they became a free nation, would ultimately be ruined if they had to start paying for labor. We'll get back to slavery in a little bit. The Declaration of Independence was also aimed at helping to rally support amongst the colonists by having a singular document signed by representatives from all 13 colonies. They also hoped that the Declaration would help to gain assistance from foreign nations. If foreign nations saw that the colonies were actually all unified towards a singular purpose of independence, maybe they could gain new allies. There was a really, really broad appeal for the Declaration of Independence, especially the part about unalienable rights. And obviously that's still true today. When people really argue against what's right or wrong about America today, one of the big things people always point out is this document and the fact that it says that all men are created equal, that we're born with a certain set of unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those rights right there were written in this declaration. Whether or not Thomas Jefferson truly and genuinely believed everybody should have equal rights, and whether or not he truly believed people really were equal, based off the fact that he owned hundreds of slaves, including many he raped and had children with, he did write words that ultimately still are groundbreaking words and really helped, again, to push the colonists forward towards independence. Very similar to Common Sense, this document was also printed and read in town squares so people could hear it. But were the colonies really unified? They weren't. While a big chunk of them could now consider themselves patriots, those who were fighting against the British, there was still a massive amount of loyalists. They were really, though, they were treated as traitors. If anyone found out that you were still loyal to Britain and you weren't in a part of the colonies that was, as a whole, still loyal to Britain, we're looking at you, Georgia, then ultimately you were seen as a traitor. And more often than not, their property was seized and they were harassed until they left. After the war, about 80,000 loyalists ended up emigrating from the US after the war to get the heck out before there was any retribution for their loyalty to Britain during the war. Most colonists, though, were actually neutral or really apathetic to the war. A lot of the other groups that had migrated during the colonial era, the Scots-Irish and the Germans, didn't feel particularly attached to what the Patriots were fighting for, and so many of them just remained further west and tried to stay out of the fighting. What are the strengths and weaknesses of England and America? For Britain, they were militaristically and economically far superior to the colonies. They could technically outdo the American colonies economically for far longer, and they had a very, very well-trained military and navy. They also had the benefit of the fact that there was a considerable amount of loyalist opposition, especially in both Georgia and sporadically throughout the rest of the colonies. The other thing that they really had going for them was the fact that the colonies didn't have a very strong government structure, both under the Continental Congresses and their very first government they established, the Articles of Confederation. On the other side, though, the colonists were far more familiar with the land and therefore participated more so in the use of guerrilla warfare, which allowed them to be able to attack England in much more unique ways than England was used to. The colonial army was also very, very resilient, and they had very strong political leadership, even if the colonies themselves weren't well organized. And finally, they had the ideological commitment. They had the will to win. For many of them, they knew that if they lost, they would be killed by Britain. And so because of that, they truly and genuinely believed that they could beat the British. Eventually, they get support from their allies, from future allies, and continued allies of even today, most notably France. Speaking of France, France got involved for a number of reasons, but most notably because they really hoped to regain power in North America and Europe, and they figured that if they could help the colonists defeat the British, they could start gaining some of their territory back. They also wanted to do it because they wanted to be able to start trading again with the colonies. Because of all of the mercantile policies and acts that had been passed, it made it very difficult for the French to be able to trade with the colonies. They were also sort of caught up with a lot of the idealism and the Enlightenment ideas that the colonies were starting to write about in the Declaration of Independence and Common Sense, and all of the language they were using about why they were fighting the war. Benjamin Franklin had been sent to France to help negotiate a treaty to convince the French to get involved. Ultimately, the French do come in after the Battle of Saratoga, one of the biggest wins for the colonies, not just because it was a huge major point to help push the British back, but also because it finally convinced the French that maybe the colonists could actually win. The French ended up sending money, weapons, naval support. They trained many of the soldiers in the Minutemen and under George Washington's army, and they even sent soldiers of their own. Significant battles to know is obviously first and foremost Lexington and Concord because it's the start of the war, and Bunker Hill because of the fact that it does help to build confidence for the colonists. Another one is Trenton, and you probably remember Trenton because of the famous picture of George Washington crossing the Delaware. There he was able to capture 1,000 soldiers, and ultimately again a success for the colonists. The next big one is the Battle of Saratoga in October 1777, where the British surrender and French finally join the war. From that point forward, though, England really focuses on the southern half of the colonies as a way to protect places where they feel like they have a larger loyalist population. And part of the reason why the southern colonies tended to be slightly more loyal to Britain than the New England colonies were, one, fewer of the acts had impacted them during all of that time leading up to the Revolution, and two, their economies were very much so successful because of the mercantile policies, because England needed their resources. They had a constant buyer of all of their goods. In terms of the African Americans in the South, many of them were promised their freedom from slavery if they fought for the side of the British. The same thing went with African Americans in the North. Even if they were free, they were oftentimes promised better treatment and better conditions in England if they fought for the English. The Battle of Yorktown was the last major battle of the war, and most importantly, the last significant battle you should know. It occurred in October of 1781, and General Cornwallis finally surrendered to the American and French troops. Part of it had to do with the fact that the French helped to block off the seas from the English Navy. In 1783, when the war is finally over, the treaty is signed. Ben Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay head to Paris, and they negotiate the end of the war and the final treaty. In the treaty, the most notable things were that England now recognized the United States as an independent nation, The boundary of the US would now extend all the way to the Mississippi River, all the way up to the Great Lakes, and all the way down to Spanish Florida. Spain was able to get back Florida in all of this, so good job, Spain, at least for a period of time. The concessions, though, were the new American citizens had to respect the rights of the Loyalists. They couldn't go around killing them or taking all their property, and they had to pay back any debts they still owed to British creditors. How did this ultimately impact the American colonies? First of all, new state constitutions were written for each and every one of these new states. And most of the state constitutions were very, very much so focused on eliminating all European laws and traditions. So, for example, nobody was allowed to take a title. If you've ever seen the musical Hamilton, or if you've ever just read more history, you will know that George Washington famously did not want a title. He did not want to be called king. He didn't want to be called Your Royal Highness. He liked the term just president because it was something simple and it was not tied back to a monarchy. There were also different ideas of what republicanism would mean, meaning what would a representative economy or government look like? Would it be something where there was a certain amount of representation based on population? Would each district of a state get the same amount of representation? And then also, who got to participate? Many states actually eliminated the property requirements for voting. For example, Pennsylvania got rid of it. Other states, like New Jersey, forgot to include the fact that they didn't want women voting. So many women actually voted in the first elections in New Jersey because it wasn't written in their state constitution that they couldn't. The one thing to notice, though, is that the colonial elite still remained in power, and part of this had a lot to do with the plantation class that had been created in the southern region. They maintained a lot of control in terms of who could be involved, and they will have a very large say when it comes to the writing of the eventual Constitution. Most states, though, did not have full democracy. As we know, women weren't allowed to vote. Free blacks weren't allowed to vote. There was still plenty of slavery. Indigenous people weren't allowed to vote. And there were plenty of limits in many of the states about land ownership still in regards to being able to vote. Another big impact politically about the American Revolution is it does ultimately inspire many other revolutions around the world. France, Haiti, and many nations in Latin America fighting for their independence against Spain. The social impact hits many groups. First, women. It plays a huge role for women because during the war, women were expected to maintain farms and businesses while men were away. They also were used in the military as nurses and cooks and laundresses. Another big name to remember is Abigail Adams. She famously told her husband, John Adams, when he went to the first Constitutional Convention to remember the ladies and called for hopefully greater rights for women. A hint, it did not work. Another big impact for women is this concept of Republican motherhood, which is just the idea that women were expected to sort of hold the ground of those Enlightenment ideas that were really instilled in the Revolution. Now they were expected to sort of focus on teaching those values to their children so that each generation of children ultimately better understood the reasons for their independence. For Native Americans, before all of this, they had often fought on the side of the British. And during the Revolutionary War, they tended to fight on the side of the British. But now that the British were gone, they had to deal with the Americans. And while the British had once limited settlement, the Americans now began spreading further and further west. The Iroquois didn't know how to handle the situation both during the war and then after the war, and they ultimately broke up because of the issue. Another major impact of the American Revolution is how it impacted African Americans in the country. Eventually, African Americans were actually allowed to fight in the Continental Army. The royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, even promised freedom to any slave who fought for the British. Again, both sides were trying to convince as many people to fight on their side. Following the Revolution, there was eventually gradual emancipation in many of the northern states and middle states. That is not going to happen in the southern states for quite a bit of time. The first famous one would have been Pennsylvania's gradual emancipation law, which was passed in 1780. What that meant was that future generations would be free. Later on, slavery, though, expanded in the South and into further Western lands as the country continued to get bigger. Slavery is going to explode once the American Revolution ends. As I had told a few people earlier, slavery had not been massive in the colonies. It was very big and it was very prominent in certain colonies like South Carolina, but it is going to explode once the revolution is over and the United States of America is now going to have to build an economy on their own. This is ultimately because of these many differences from the northern or states starting to lead to gradual emancipation and the southern states really clinging to slavery is going to create very distinct regional attitudes towards slavery. And the other big thing is slavery will ultimately be protected in the Constitution.